Welcome back to the Norfolk Currents podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rice. Today we're at the Elizabeth River Project, their new building over on Colley Avenue, joined by Luisa Black Ellis. Luisa, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Paul. I'm excited to be here.
So, Luisa, tell me about your role here at the Elizabeth River Project.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the resilience manager here, which means a lot of different things, but mainly it means I'm really focused on organizing this building that we're in for success, to be impactful through educational programs, through art, through interdisciplinary research, and also just through educating people about the green systems that we have jam-packed in here. So sort of like a very short, high-level answer is, Norfolk is already in the global conversation because of sea level rise, because of our ultra-high rate of sea level rise. And one of the things that we're trying to accomplish here is put us on the global map, not just for being one of the places with the biggest problem, but also for being a leader in sort of grassroots solutions to those problems.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you mentioned this building here. Mm-hmm. This is the brand new Ryan Resilience Lab, is that right?
That's right, yeah. Okay.
So can you tell us more about that? What is so impressive and important about this building?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that I like to say about this building is I think what makes it really unique is that we're not trying to get the best money can buy in sustainability here. So like I said, the entire building is outfitted with super sustainable, super green technologies, but it's not like a Rolls Royce of sustainability. It's like a sturdy kind of Honda Civic from 2001. Like it's gonna run forever and most people can afford it. So we have, for example, the carpets underneath our feet. These were made out of recycled fishing nets found at the bottom of the ocean.
Wow.
Outside this beautiful balcony where we have a wonderful view to the river, we have a living shoreline, rain gardens. Our entire roof is guttered and goes to two 5,000-gallon cisterns. That water is sterilized and filtered and then injected with blue dye, and then it flushes our toilets.
Oh, cool.
We have solar panels, and everywhere we don't have a solar panel on our roof, we have a green roof. So it's a vegetated structure that anyone can set onto their roof if they have a flat roof, and it filters the water, absorbs it, reduces our heat island effect. And then outside some of these windows, we're starting to grow up a trellis, a living wall with native vines. We have native plants throughout, which we were talking about a little bit before we hopped on. So we tried down to the tiniest detail of this building. We tried to think about how we could protect our river, protect the environment as a whole, how we could be more resilient and more sustainable. And also at every single turn, we asked, can the average homeowner or business owner actually afford to implement this? And if the answer was no, we didn't do it. Yep. So I feel really proud as a resident of Norfolk to have a building like this in our community, because I think it's extremely unique and it's already gathering like national attention.
Yeah, that's impressive. All those set of features are really unique and interesting. Not something I would expect to find maybe on your average Honda Civic. So what about this do you think makes it more the Honda Civic than the Rolls Royce? Is it just the kind of affordability aspect of the features and the plan?
Yeah, I'll use an example like our cisterns. So you might have been wondering when I said it flushes our toilets, like, well, that's kind of like a weird and arbitrary thing. Like, why not composting toilets for one? Or if you're bothering to capture all that rainwater, why not use it for your drinking water? So we didn't do composting toilets in one direction because the polls are in. People don't want to handle their own composting toilets. So the consensus was people don't want to do this. So we didn't want to model a system that people don't want to do. And then we didn't go in the other direction of harvesting rainwater to drink or to, use in our sinks, because it's exceptionally difficult to get a permitting exception for that in Norfolk and in most municipalities. So it's possible, like the Brock Environmental Center does it, but again, we asked ourselves, like, is the average person really going to go through the trouble of jumping through all these hoops to make this happen? And the answer was no. So we found a happy balance, which was using it to flush our toilets, which is, definitely kind of radical, but it's still possible.
Yeah, that's incredible. And there's some features like the kayak launch here that maybe not every homeowner will see, but are these also practices that you expect other businesses might be picking up too?
Yeah, we would love to see that. I mean, if you're on the water, why not?
Yeah.
I'm excited to have it for my personal use, and a lot of the other practices that I mentioned, like rain gardens and rain barrels, conservation landscaping, living shorelines. Not only are those really important to the story of the restoration of the Elizabeth River, which we are on here in Norfolk, but we also, the Elizabeth River Project offers like pretty generous cost sharing for people to put them in their own homes and businesses. So that's another way that it's accessible to the public of Norfolk.
So what does that mean, cost sharing? That means if somebody wants to take on one of those new features or resilience techniques, that you guys will help split the bill with them?
Exactly. Yeah. We will offer consultation, design, and installation ourselves. Like we'll do it all ourselves, and we'll cost share a significant portion of that depending on what practice it is.
Cool. And then this building, the Ryan Resilience Lab, what role is it going to serve? Is this going to be more classrooms, or is this office space for the ERP? What's it going to do here?
The answer is yes. So this is our working office for a lot of our staff who are based here in Norfolk. And it also, this room that we're in is called the River Room. We've already held a bunch of public programs in here. So we're holding our own programs. We have an art show that you see around you called All Water Has a Perfect Memory. That is a quote taken from a Toni Morrison passage where she's talking about how they redirected and filled in the Mississippi River, so it's about 2/3 its size. And now the river floods those places where they filled in. But she goes on to say, well, that's what they call it, flooding, but it's not in fact flooding, it's remembering. She goes on to say, all water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. And we thought that was really appropriate here in Norfolk because, as you probably know, so many of our major roads and major neighborhoods are just filled in riverbed, like Tidewater Drive. Perfect name for it. It's a riverbed. So especially now as sea levels rise, all those places where they filled in, the water is returning faster and faster. And we wanted to be thinking about, how can we work with that rising water instead of denying that it's happening or fighting it off with strategies that are ineffective. Yeah, so that's one example of what we're trying to do here. We're really focused on interdisciplinary research and restoration and play. Like something we're interested in is sort of filling this niche of climate hope. Like climate change and sea level rise is something that I know I personally feel an enormous amount of despair and powerlessness about, and I think that's the sentiment of a lot of people in our generation and younger. But there are many avenues of direct, demonstrable impact that we can have as everyday people. And what we want to do here, one of the things that we want to do here is build a sort of grassroots community resilience that everyone can be a part of. So we're using things like art and dance and play, as well as science and restoration, to create a pathway for more diverse audiences to be a part of this conversation and really affect it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think that's really important given that, the sea level rise or climate change generally is going to affect all of us here in the community. What types of programming are you all going to be doing to bring those folks in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have already started some community science work here, like the amazing community science program, Measure the Muck and Catch the King, which Margie Mulholland at ODU, we partnered with her. And we also partnered with this organization called Butterfly Village, which is building up young women and girls of color in STEM. So we kind of brought these two organizations together and we had a training on how to what Measure the Muck does is they measure the pollution associated with ultra high tide flooding events, like the king tide, which we recently had in Norfolk. So, a lot of people know about the king tide or know about this crazy flooding problem that we have in Norfolk. But what some people don't realize is that when the water washes up over the pavement and the lawns, it carries all these pollutants back into the river with it when it drains down the storm drain or just directly back into the river. So
like fertilizer, dog poop,
exactly.
What else? Yeah.
Even like medicines, just straight up trash. So what these community scientists are doing is they're taking samples of that water, of those floodwaters, and then studying it in the lab and trying to better understand how that pollution is affecting the river, because that is a climate change related pollution. So for example, now as much pollution as was once predicted to enter the river from a year of high tide flooding now goes into the river from one day.
Wow.
And that we wouldn't know that if it weren't for this program. So it's a really cool program, period.
Right.
And then I think what was really interesting about this series, and it was part of a larger series that we have recently started called Link Up, which is intergenerational mentorship for BIPOC youth in the environmental sciences. What's really cool is they got to actually like take the samples themselves, look at the results, analyze them, and present their findings to their community. So it's empowering them as researchers who have agency in this issue. And then what I think is super cool is that Mulholland and her colleagues published the names of everybody who collects the research in their academic papers. So those girls are now all published scientists, you know, at the age of like 9 to 16.
Yeah.
So that's one example. We also have, in the context of this art show, we have partnerships with Virginia Wesleyan, ODU, and Norfolk State University. So their students will be creating response works to this art, and then that art will then hang in the space for the following 6 months after this art is deinstalled. And they will be, you know, studying them in their classes and ideally bringing their friends and family into the conversation as well. So these are like art students, not necessarily wetland scientists, who are a part of the public conversation in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love to see the art and science happening kind of throughout the ages. On the science front, you know, you guys are collecting so much data and kind of processing that, and I'm sure other organizations are too. What's the kind of current state of health of the Elizabeth River, Lafayette River, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we recently put out the most recent state of the river. So what that does is we work with stakeholders from many different communities, including other scientific communities like ODU and FIMS, and we sort of make an assessment of ideally the improvements in the health of the river as a whole, as well as specific branches, and that helps us understand our restoration goals for the next 5 to 10 years. So the state of the river overall was assessed at a C, which it used to be a failing grade, so it's still improving.
So classic grade school A to F scale here.
Exactly, exactly. And we're very, very close to a B. Like, we just need that one last extra credit assignment.
Okay.
And we're very hopeful that in the next 3-year cycle, we will be at a B. The Lafayette actually is the first branch of the Elizabeth River, and the Lafayette is the branch that we're on here in Norfolk for the most part, as well as the main stem of the river. This is the first river that was fully restored for oysters in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And you see that reflected in the quality of water and the diversity of the animals that you see in the Lafayette. So, you know, I can tell you it's at a letter grade, but more impactful is to know that there are river otters and there are bottlenose dolphins and seahorses in the Lafayette. And that's something that anybody can look at and understand, like, okay, this river is healthy. Like, the Elizabeth River was once so polluted and so considered dead that not only would scientists have competitions to see who could like pull out the most deformed fish out of the river, like in The Simpsons, like fish with 2 heads and 3 eyes. Like, I'm not making it up. Like, they would have these contests.
Wow. Here in the Elizabeth River.
Here in the Elizabeth River. And it was actually like a national joke, like on Seinfeld. One of the characters like swims in the Hudson, and the other character is like, what are you doing? Like, this is the most polluted body of water in America. And the guy says, well, actually the Elizabeth beats it for commercial traffic. And it's true. Like, we are, you know, one of the oldest developed rivers in America, the oldest colonized rivers, and we are an enormous port. So we as an urban watershed face, just like on a national scale, some of the greatest challenges to our river ecosystem's health. And despite that, we see bottlenose dolphins in the river. So I think that's a really incredible testament to the restoration efforts of the people of Norfolk and the people of the Elizabeth River watershed as a whole, because almost all of these wetlands that were restored were voluntary. And yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Cool. Well, you know, 400 years of pollution seems like it could be a lot to clean up. And I understand the Elizabeth River Project has been around since 1993 or thereabouts. What are the projects that have been kind of pushing that bar forward so that we can now claim to have such clean rivers?
Yeah. So we have, well, in 1997, I believe it was, we started the River Star Business Program. So the way that program works is that it's totally voluntary and totally free. So there were a lot of environmental organizations in the 90s that were like suing businesses and industries for their pollution in the river. And what we did as an organization is we convened a really large group of stakeholders, and we asked the community, what do you think it will take to clean this river? Not broad strokes environmental restoration as a whole, but what will work here? And overwhelmingly, the answer was to not finger point and not blame the people who were responsible for the pollution, but approach them with a collaborative attitude. So that's what we did first through River Star Businesses. And
so a little more carrot than stick, is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So the way it works is that we approach a business or they approach us, and we give them some examples of things that they can do to minimize their pollution in the river specifically, as well as, build a more environmentally sustainable environment for everyone. So even broad things like changing your light bulbs out for LEDs, that might not necessarily affect the river, but it still contributes to a healthier future for all of us. So you can do that through pollution prevention or habitat restoration. And since then, I believe, I need to check this number, but I believe over 3 billion pounds of pollution have been diverted from the river since 1997 through this program. We have over 143 River Star businesses, and they've also created like thousands of acres of habitat. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact number, but it's a lot. So that's River Star Businesses. And then because that program was so successful, we had a lot of homeowners asking, well, what can I do? I don't have a business, but I want to be a part of restoring the river. So we have the River Star Homes program, and all you have to do is commit to 7 simple steps. It's free, just like River Star Businesses. You don't even have to be a member of ERP. And when you commit to those steps, you get a beautiful lawn flag that says how amazing you are for healing the river.
Yeah.
And like I said, through the River Star Homes program, we also offer cost sharing for installing a rain garden, which will keep polluted stormwater out of the river, or installing a living shoreline, which will not only protect the coast and hold your shoreline together, but that's also creating habitat, that's also absorbing stormwater, as well as conservation landscaping, which is just creating habitat for our local flora and fauna, who we all love, like river otters and herons.
Yeah, so you mentioned the oyster reefs, and as being part of this cleanup effort, can you tell us more about how oysters are helping to clean the Lafayette and Elizabeth River?
Yeah, absolutely. So oysters, they can filter, opinions vary.
Yeah.
They can filter anywhere from 15 to 50 gallons of water, depending on conditions, a day. So that's an organism about this big.
Yeah.
So if you think about like a gallon of water, like a gallon of milk, and how many of those fit in your fridge, kind of put the oyster and the fridge next to each other in your mind. It's pretty amazing capacity.
So one oyster replaces my Brita filter. I can just say 1 for 1. Yeah.
So these oysters are not only, and when I say filtering the water, I mean like sediments, nutrients, as well as carbon. So they also act as carbon sinks.
Cool.
So here in a coastal environment, a lot of people think like, well, I want to offset emissions, so I'm going to plant a tree. But here you should actually probably plant an oyster or plant a wetland grass like Spartina, because those are the plants that are adapted to our ecosystem that will be more resilient to climate change, and then also, because they're adapted to this ecosystem, sequester the most carbon. So not only are they protecting our shorelines as sea level rise, not only are they filtering the pollutants from the river, but they're also sequestering carbon, which is the root cause of climate change and sea level rise, of course. So they're really powerful organisms, and they love it here. They're meant for this river. And the Elizabeth River once was just this like thriving expanse of oyster reefs and living shorelines. So it's really special to see them coming back, even just on like I want to say like a spiritual level, like they belong here. Besides the fact that, of course, they're helping heal the river, just like our wetland grasses are.
And so if somebody who lived, say in a colonial place on the river, and they want to plant oysters, like you're saying, how do they go about that? What's that process look like?
So they can reach out to us.
Yeah.
And we will give them a free consultation and help them figure out how to go about doing that. There can be a permitting process in setting up an oyster reef. So we can help people through that permitting process, which can be daunting to do on your own, and cost share. And we also, maybe you're not the ideal candidate for an oyster reef, but you still love oysters and you want to get involved. We have another program called Catch the Spat, where people who live on the water, we give them a little cage of oysters, because oysters lay their young on other oysters.
Okay.
So this cage during the oyster spawning season, oysters will, like the wild oysters of the river, will lay their young on them. And then we gather those cages back up. We distribute them all through the different branches of the Elizabeth, and then we gather them up and we count the spat, which is the word for baby oysters, on each cage. And that helps us understand what different levels of recruitment are across the different branches. So as you might guess, in the Lafayette, recruitment levels are really high because we have a really healthy community of oysters thanks to our community's restoration efforts. But in other branches of the Elizabeth River, the recruitment levels are really low, and that helps us understand and prioritize where we need to focus our restoration efforts.
So outside of the kind of wildlife and the plants that you guys are helping to restore, I understand you've worked on some projects that are helping to kind of clean the muck out of some former industrial areas where there was a lot of pollution kind of layered deep in the mud. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that spot where I was talking about scientists would pull deformed fish, that was often in the southern branch of the Elizabeth River, which that's kind of towards Chesapeake. And that part of the Elizabeth is called Moneypoint. So there had been a lot of creosote processing in that part of the Elizabeth. So there was just this like ultra polluted gunk, essentially, at the bottom of the river. And this is a sort of famously difficult problem to solve in wetland restoration. There's really nothing you can do except scoop it out, but you can't ever scoop all of it, and you can't exactly like Lysol it out. So what we did, and I believe this was the first living cap of its kind, what we did is we did a combination of scoop and capping. So we took out the polluted sediments, and then we backfilled it with sand, and then we planted a living shoreline over top of it. So that was sort of creating a barrier. You know, those polluted sediments will always be there, but now we have this sort of living membrane between the organisms of Moneypoint and the polluted sediments, and we also significantly reduced the amount of polluted sediments that were there.
So they can't just actually freely float around in the water.
Exactly. So since then, we have seen the return of animals like seahorses, which are, extremely sensitive. Since then, the background levels of cancer in the mummichog fish, which were the fish that they were pulling out of Moneypoint, have fallen back almost immediately to zero, to background levels. So that is one of the examples of one of our more sort of large-scale projects that was in partnership with the city of Chesapeake, as well as many other organizations, to clean up a pollution issue that was like broader than the scope of the residential or the industrial. So we try to work at sort of everyone's scale.
And do you think there's a lot more large-scale projects like that need to be undertaken alongside all of the kind of small interventions of businesses and homeowners and that sort of thing? Yeah, definitely. I'm not an expert in this, but I know that we recently received the funds that were needed for the final phase of the Moneypoint restoration. So what I just described, the living cap, was a previous phase of a very long timeline of phased restoration. So we're looking forward to completing the final phase of that project. And there are many other larger scale projects along the Elizabeth that have been identified. I just don't know very much about them. But Joe Rieger, our director of restoration, is a great resource on that. Yeah, very cool. And so a lot of folks maybe don't realize how expansive the Elizabeth River is. It's not just the kind of water line here in Norfolk, but it includes the Lafayette River, right, which isn't obviously part of the Elizabeth River. Can you tell us more about this kind of broader ecosystem that is the Elizabeth River? Yeah,
absolutely. So it helps me to think about the term branches, because you can kind of think of it as like an inverted tree or a root system. So like in downtown Norfolk, that part of Norfolk, or like the body of water that you cross when you take the ferry, for example, that's the main branch of the Elizabeth River. So that's sort of like the trunk. And then as you go south or east or west, you start getting into tributaries and branches. So the Lafayette is like one branch flowing off of the main trunk of the Elizabeth. And then there's the southern branch, which I was just talking about, which goes down into Chesapeake, western branch, which is also Chesapeake, as well as Portsmouth is in the watershed. In Portsmouth is where we have our other major facility, which is Paradise Creek Nature Park.
Okay.
So that is it was an extremely industrial area. It's about 40 acres now of restored wetlands and shorelines. We did that all ourselves.
That's a lot of space.
Yeah. And totally public walking trails. People take their dogs and bikes there. We have we have a classroom as well as an outdoor pavilion and a public kayak launch there as well, which is handicap accessible. So that is an example of like not only a really large-scale wetland restoration site, but also a place where everyday people can come into contact with the Elizabeth River and know that they're coming into contact with the Elizabeth River. Like you said, speaking for myself, before I started this work, I think water was just so much a part of my life, and I was so accustomed to just like, I'm driving down the road, so I'm going to cross like 3 bodies of water on the way.
Yeah.
But that is not, that's not what everywhere looks like. So Norfolk is this like incredibly watery place, but again, just speaking for myself, I didn't often stop and think about the water that I was surrounded by, the water that totaled my car, the water that I have to cross 5 times to get to the grocery store. Like that water has a name, and it is the home of an endlessly diverse set of organisms that belong to this place really meaningfully, and that we have a responsibility to.
You mentioned the importance of hope as we look out at, maybe bigger climate change or just restoration here locally. What's the big hope for the Elizabeth River Project over the next 5 or 10 years for their work?
Yeah, thank you for asking. To restore the Elizabeth River.
Yeah.
In very broad strokes, to expand our impact in our human and non-human communities. So to continue these really large-scale restoration projects like Moneypoint, like Paradise Creek Park, and to also like build the movement for more and more people to understand their roles as agents with the power to have an impact and a responsibility to have an impact in their home watershed.
So, how would you maybe paint the picture of what restoration looks like? Because I think a lot of folks who have, grown up here or are new to here, they haven't seen the, in essence, maybe the glory days of the Elizabeth River when it was pristine, and probably nobody alive has. So how would you maybe paint the picture for folks of what, really great and incredible restoration would look like in, in the next couple of years?
Every shore a living shoreline.
Right.
And a network of interconnected habitats and wetlands that are walkable, that everybody in our community has access to, not just the privileged few. I think that's a really important part of the work that we're doing, that there's equitable tree canopy, equitable access to water, and the plants and animals that belong to that water. I think for there to be a consensus as a community that wetlands are what's needed for the river to heal, and for us to take responsibility as a community for putting those wetlands in on the borders of rivers. And a wetland, to define my term,
Sure.
is, so we pass the edge of a water almost every day in Norfolk, and there are a couple of different ways that edge can look. It can just be like a wall, like a 90-degree bulkhead. It can be riprap, which is like really big rocks piled onto where the land just stops, or the land can just stop, it can just fall away. Or it can be a gently graded slope with a progression of native species that are adapted to the levels of water that correspond to different points in that slope. And that's what we call a living shoreline. So a living shoreline is just putting the land back roughly the way that it was, as close as we can approximate. And an interconnected network of living shorelines and native plantings is in many ways like the best bet that Norfolk has, not only for the restoration of the river, but also for climate resilience.
Yeah. So when you mentioned tree canopies and these kind of native species that are interconnected, it's not just those that are maybe in the wetlands and in the river, but you're also talking about the plants that are in people's homes and on the streets that are, blocks away from the waterfront. How does that relate? How does that tie in and to keeping the river healthy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think maybe this is another helpful term to define. A lot of people don't know what is meant by watershed. So one way to think about it is that a watershed is the area around a body of water, like the Elizabeth River, that sheds water into that river.
Right.
So the land here in Norfolk sort of gently slopes into the river, and that's what makes us a watershed. So one way that what we plant upland impacts what is closer to the water is that it's literally flowing into the river, whether down the slope or through our storm drains. So if you think about it, like if you have a yard in Norfolk, you're one of the lucky few. And also you might not think that it's important to pick up after your dog in your yard because, hey, it's my yard. Like I'm the one who's walking through it.
Right.
But when it rains, that rain carries the particles from that into the storm drain. And then the storm drain doesn't go through any filtration system. Like it's not like if you think about it, our sewage water goes through this really intense process of treatment before it gets disposed of into the river. But stormwater just goes directly into the river. There's no mitigation. So when we plant something like a rain garden, which you can think of as sort of like a bathtub of plants.
Okay.
So the way a rain garden works is it's this little like shallow depression. Often we punch through the clay layer that we often have here in Norfolk and in Tidewater generally. We get through that clay to some more permeable soil underneath. And then we fill that basin with more like fluffy permeable soils, like compost and sand. And then we plant that with native plants that have really long roots and that can filter the water as well as hold the soil together. So when it rains, that depression fills up like a bathtub, and then over time, that bathtub can slowly drain into the aquifer. And that's important because we're keeping polluted stormwater out of the river. It's not sheet flowing into the river or into the storm drain. We're planting native plants, which provide habitat for our native wildlife, as well as food and forage. And we're also in that process, not only keeping stormwater out of the river, but we're also giving it an opportunity to recharge into the aquifer or to the groundwater. So one of the reasons why Norfolk has such a high rate, we actually have the highest rate of sea level rise on the East Coast, is one of these reasons, is because Norfolk is literally sinking, right?
Right.
Everybody knows. So the reason that Norfolk is sinking is because our aquifer is sort of like a balloon that holds the land above it in place. But because Norfolk has been developed for so long, that aquifer is extremely depleted. So as the balloon shrinks, the land underneath it settles. So when we put in rain gardens and other they're called best management practices that hold the water before it gets to the river or before it gets to the storm drain. Not only are we preventing pollution in the river, but we're also recharging literally the aquifer.
Yeah.
So it's a very direct, it has a very direct impact on offsetting, even in a small way, the land subsidence that we're talking about when we say Norfolk is sinking.
Cool. So those permeable surfaces are going to help us to not just keep the water from flowing in the streets and flooding, but also going to help us to stop sinking.
Yeah.
Or sink less, maybe?
Yeah. Our subsidence rate, I think, according to the last VIMS report, is going to stay pretty steady. So it's not going to get worse.
Okay.
Whereas sea level rise, of course, is accelerating.
Right.
Yeah.
We're here at the Rime Resilience Lab, and I know that it's already gotten several big accolades. Is that right? And it's kind of hopefully going to be known across the world for those folks who are kind of living really close by or, just coming to enjoy the North Collie area businesses. How can they expect to interact with the Rime Resilience Lab on the kind of day-to-day?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So we have a regular schedule of tours, so you can register online or you can pop by anytime. You can go to elizabethriver.org/events to find out about those regularly scheduled tours. We also have pretty regular public programs, like we had an opening of the art show. We had a beautiful panel and symphony performance here a few weeks ago, and then an open house, which we'll be planning more open houses in early next year, as well as regular workshops and classes. And we're also open to the public 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. So you can just swing by and say hello. And also, because you mentioned North Collie, I did want to plug the Ryan Resilience Lab has actually sparked a widespread interest in restoring Knitting Mill Creek, which is, so the Lafayette is a branch of the Elizabeth, and Knitting Mill Creek is a finger of the Lafayette.
Got it.
So here on North Collie, we're on Knitting Mill Creek, as well as Colonial Place across the street. And we, through like a 3-year process with stakeholders from the community and businesses on North Collie, came up with this plan to restore Knitting Mill Creek. And one of the outcomes of that plan was the establishment of this stretch of North Collie as an eco-district.
Wow.
So it's really amazing. From around 10 years of community organizing in Norfolk, I have never seen this much widespread enthusiasm and excitement about a project across the board.
Yeah.
We have bird film going up on our, so what you see in front of you, these little dots on the window, they're called bird reflective tape. And the reason that we're doing that is because birds hitting windows, bird strikes, is the leading cause of human-related bird death in the US. So these dots basically visually signal to the birds that this is not a part of the sky that I can fly through.
Got it. Yeah.
So that's another one of our systems that we're hoping people will see and replicate if they have giant windows. I live in Norfolk, and a hawk flew into my window, and I was really concerned that hawk might have been seriously injured by that. But the eco district.
Yeah.
So there are, I think, 13 businesses just in this little 10-block stretch of North Collie that have signed onto this plan and that are excited to participate. So they'll have stickers in their windows, and they'll be talking to people who visit their businesses about what steps that they're taking to restore the Elizabeth. So Lady Fern Native Plants, for example, is a great place to buy native plants, which we were talking about. And she also recycles rainwater just like we do, except to water her native plants. And then Daphne's Hair Studio across the street, she's putting in a native plant garden and rain barrels. And there are a dozen more businesses who, even if they're not necessarily environmentally related, they are doing whatever they can in their niche of the economy to protect the river. And that's what we really love to see. But we've also had businesses like the Electrified Marina, which rents only electric boats, that they located here specifically because of the Ryan Resilience Lab.
Wow.
As well as the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience, which is an institute of ODU, co-located also because of the Ryan Resilience Lab. So we're seeing existing businesses become more environmentally minded, and we're also seeing a growth of environmentally minded businesses. So really excited.
Yeah, that's incredible. We've had Arts District and we've had Railroad District, but an Eco District seems really special, and I'm excited to see all that enthusiasm there. And then lastly, I know that this new building is not cheap, even if it's maybe the Mercedes-Benz of, a Honda Accord of resilience. But who do we have to thank for kind of helping to, fund this and put all this together?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So the naming donor of this building is Prue and Louis Ryan. So they were the ones who we had several, almost as soon as we sort of tested the waters with this vague plan that we had for this building, we had several $1 million gifts right away. And that is another example of just this groundswell of community support that we've seen for this project. And Prue and Louis Ryan were among the first of those, and they also gave the largest gift of those. So we're very thankful to them. And right now we are in the Macon and Joan Brock River Room, which is where we'll be holding most of our public programs and events. So we're very thankful to the Brocks, as well as all of our donors, from the $1 Million Club to every single person who gives $5 a month, like me. That every single gift makes a world of difference, and all of this was made possible by our members and volunteers, people who picked up a shovel or just, gave a couple bucks every month to heal the river.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited for what you all are doing for the city and all the rivers. And thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, have a good one.
Thanks.